Wow, is this cereal really $7.99? I could have sworn it was $5.99 last week.
Ah, welcome to the world of tariffs. Prices go up, but paychecks stay the same.
Tariffs? How do they affect my cereal? I'm not importing breakfast from Europe.
Not directly, but when tariffs are imposed on imports, companies raise prices to cover those costs. Like this juice, look at that 20% tariff sign.
So, all these price hikes are because of tariffs? I thought tariffs were meant to help us.
Well, it depends on who you ask. The government says jobs will come back and the economy will thrive.
So we pay more now, but it's all supposed to work out later? Really?
That's the idea. But critics argue that tariffs are just a hidden tax on consumers, making everything pricier without real benefits.
There will be some short-term pain, but this is the price we must pay to rebuild our industries and make America great again. Tariffs will create jobs, protect our economy, and make us self-reliant.
So are tariffs a smart move or just a scam? What's your take on it?
That's the million-dollar question and what we're about to find out.
You walk into your local supermarket, grab your usual groceries, and head to checkout. But then, sticker shock. That carton of eggs, up 30%. Your favorite cereal, suddenly costs as much as a fast food meal. What's going on? If you're thinking it's just inflation, think again. There's another factor quietly pushing up prices. Tariffs. Tariffs are import taxes placed on foreign goods. And while they might sound like something only businesses worry about, their effects hit your wallet just as hard. When companies are forced to pay more to bring products into the country, they don't just take the loss, they pass the cost onto you, the consumer. Take fruit, for example. If imported oranges from Mexico suddenly get a 20% tariff, supermarkets won't just absorb the extra cost. They'll raise the price of oranges for everyone. That means, whether you're buying American-grown fruit or imported varieties, you'll likely pay more across the board. But why impose tariffs in the first place? Supporters argue they're a necessary tool to protect local businesses and create jobs. The idea is simple. By making foreign goods more expensive, American companies can compete more fairly. More competition means more jobs, stronger businesses, and a self-reliant economy. At least, that's the theory. In reality, the impact of tariffs is more complicated. Sometimes, they help boost domestic industries. Other times, they do the opposite, raising prices, causing shortages, and even leading to job losses in unexpected sectors. So the big question is this: are tariffs truly an economic power move, or just a sneaky tax disguised as a strategy? As we explore this debate, let's take a step back and understand exactly what tariffs are, how they work, and why they're such a hot topic. We hear about tariffs all the time, but what exactly are they? Are they just another tax? A trade weapon? A way to protect jobs? The answer is all of the above. At their core, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. When a country wants to discourage foreign competition or boost local industries, it places tariffs on certain products. The idea? Make imports more expensive, so consumers and businesses are more likely to buy from domestic producers instead. Let's say a company wants to import steel from another country. If there's a 25% tariff on steel, that means every $100 worth of imported steel now costs $125, and that extra cost doesn't just disappear. The company either raises prices, cuts jobs, or absorbs losses, all of which affect the economy. Tariffs come in different forms. The two main types are specific tariffs, a fixed dollar amount per unit of goods, and ad valorem tariffs, which are based on a percentage of the item's value. For example, a 10% ad valorem tariff means a $1,000 product now costs $1,100 at import. But here's where things get tricky. Tariffs don't just affect the industries they target. They ripple through the entire economy. If the US puts tariffs on foreign microchips, for example, that affects prices for smartphones, cars, washing machines, anything that uses those chips. Supporters argue that tariffs are essential to protect local businesses, prevent unfair trade practices, and even reduce reliance on foreign economies. They believe tariffs create a level playing field, helping struggling industries survive against lower-cost foreign competition. But critics say tariffs do more harm than good. Higher costs get passed down to consumers. Inflation rises, and in many cases, businesses find ways around tariffs by shifting production to other countries that aren't affected. So if tariffs are meant to protect jobs and industries, why do some economists say they do the opposite? Let's take a closer look at history and see what tariffs have done for the US economy before. Tariffs might feel like a modern controversy, but they've actually been a core part of American economic policy for over 2 centuries. In fact, for much of US history, tariffs weren't just a tool. They were the government's primary source of revenue. Long before income tax existed, tariffs on imported goods funded the federal government. In the early 1800s, tariffs accounted for over 90% of federal income, paying for everything from infrastructure to national defense. One of the biggest advocates for tariffs? Alexander Hamilton. The founding father believed the young US economy couldn't compete with Britain's powerful industries unless it protected its own manufacturers. So in 1789, the US passed its first major tariff law to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. The strategy worked. Tariffs helped America build factories, create jobs, and industrialize. But they weren't without consequences. In the 19th century, high tariffs benefited the North, but hurt the South, which relied on exporting cotton and buying cheap European goods. This division even fueled tensions leading up to the Civil War. By the late 1800s, the US had some of the highest tariffs in the world. They helped transform the country into an industrial superpower, but they also made consumer goods more expensive. As the economy grew, industries demanded lower tariffs to expand trade. The biggest shift came after World War II. The US became the world's leading economy and championed free trade. It helped create international agreements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, WTO. The goal? Lower tariffs, increase trade, and boost global economic growth. For decades, this worked. American businesses flourished in a global market, and consumers enjoyed cheaper goods. But there was a downside. Manufacturing jobs started disappearing. Companies moved production overseas to take advantage of lower costs, fewer regulations, and cheaper labor. By the early 2000s, free trade had become the norm. Then, everything changed. The 2008 financial crisis reignited the debate. Did free trade go too far? Were American jobs being sacrificed for cheaper imports? In 2018, the US made a dramatic shift back toward protectionism, imposing tariffs on China and other trading partners. So, after centuries of back and forth, what have we learned? Tariffs can help industries grow, but they also come with economic trade-offs. The real challenge? Finding the right balance. But how do modern tariffs actually work in practice? Let's break it down. For decades, the US and China had a booming trade relationship. American businesses got access to cheap labor and manufacturing, while China gained economic power by becoming the world's factory floor. But by 2018, things changed dramatically. The US government accused China of unfair trade practices, currency manipulation, and intellectual property theft. In response, the US launched a trade war, imposing billions of dollars in tariffs on Chinese goods. China retaliated with its own tariffs, and suddenly, two of the world's largest economies were locked in an economic standoff. At the heart of the dispute, jobs and economic power. The U.S. argued that years of cheap imports had hollowed out American manufacturing, leading to job losses in key industries like steel, electronics, and textiles. The goal of the tariffs? To make it more expensive for U.S. companies to outsource production, forcing them to bring jobs back home. The problem? Tariffs didn't just hurt China, they also raised prices for American businesses and consumers. Companies that relied on Chinese-made parts and materials suddenly faced higher costs. And those costs didn't just disappear, they were passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices on everything from washing machines to smartphones. And then there was the retaliation. China imposed its own tariffs on American exports, hitting industries like agriculture, automobiles, and technology. Farmers in particular took a massive hit as Chinese buyers turned to other countries for soybeans, pork, and dairy products. To counteract this, the U.S. government spent billions in subsidies to bail out farmers impacted by the trade war. The numbers tell the story. By 2019, the U.S. had imposed over $360 billion in tariffs on Chinese goods. China responded with over $110 billion in retaliatory tariffs. The result? A slowdown in global trade, stock market volatility, and increased uncertainty for businesses. Even after the trade war cooled down, many of these tariffs remained in place. And the big question remains, did they actually work? Some economists argue that tariffs pushed China to negotiate better trade deals and helped American businesses compete. Others say they hurt U.S. consumers and farmers more than they helped. But the U.S.-China trade war isn't just about money, it's about global economic dominance. As China grows into an economic superpower, will tariffs be enough to shift the balance back in America's favor? One thing is clear. The trade war reshaped how countries think about tariffs. But do tariffs actually protect jobs? Let's take a closer look. One of the biggest arguments for tariffs is simple. They protect American jobs. If foreign companies can't undercut U.S. manufacturers with cheaper goods, more businesses will keep production at home, right? Well, it's complicated. At first glance, tariffs do protect some jobs, especially in industries that struggle to compete with cheap imports. Take the steel industry. In 2018, the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on foreign steel, making American-made steel relatively cheaper. This led to thousands of new jobs in steel plants. Success, right? Not exactly. While steel jobs increased, industries that use steel, like car manufacturers and construction companies, suffered. Why? Because their raw material costs skyrocketed. The result? More expensive cars, buildings, and machinery. And when businesses can't handle these rising costs, they cut jobs elsewhere. In fact, economists found that while tariffs saved about 8,700 steel jobs, they led to over 75,000 job losses in other industries that relied on steel. So while tariffs can protect jobs in targeted industries, they don't always create a net gain. Instead, they often shift jobs from one sector to another while making products more expensive for everyone. Then, there's the automation problem. Even when tariffs successfully protect industries, they don't guarantee those jobs will stay in the long run. Many companies use tariffs as temporary protection, only to later invest in automation, robotics, and outsourcing to non-tariffed countries. Take the washing machine industry. In 2018, the US slapped a 50% tariff on imported washing machines. The result? Prices rose by $86 per machine, and American manufacturers initially ramped up production. But within 2 years, most companies had either automated their factories or found loopholes by shifting production to Vietnam and Thailand. And we haven't even talked about retaliation. When the US imposes tariffs, other countries don't just sit back, they strike back with tariffs of their own. In response to US tariffs, China, the EU, and Canada targeted American industries like farming, whiskey, and automotive exports. American farmers were hit especially hard. Soybean exports to China, a $14 billion industry, collapsed overnight. The US government had to spend over $60 billion in bailout funds to keep farms from going under. So, do tariffs protect jobs? The answer is sometimes. But they also create winners and losers. They might save jobs in one industry while destroying jobs in another. And if companies just automate or move production elsewhere, the long-term benefits may never materialize. So, if tariffs don't necessarily save jobs, why do governments keep using them? One argument is that they generate government revenue, which in theory could be used to lower personal income taxes. But could tariffs really replace income taxes and fund the government? Or is that just wishful thinking? Let's explore whether tariffs could actually be a solution to lowering personal taxes. If tariffs generate billions in government revenue, could they actually replace income taxes? It's a bold idea, one that's been around for centuries. In fact, before income taxes existed, tariffs were the primary way the US government funded itself. Throughout the 19th century, tariffs made up 90% of federal revenue. Roads, military spending, government programs, all paid for with import taxes. Back then, America's economy was much simpler. It was mostly agriculture and manufacturing, and tariffs on imported goods were enough to cover the government's budget. But today, the numbers tell a different story. In 2023, the US imported over $3.1 trillion worth of goods. If the government applied a universal 20% tariff on all imports, it would generate about $620 billion per year. Sounds like a lot, right? But here's the problem. The federal government's annual budget is over $6 trillion. Even with a massive tariff increase, revenue from tariffs wouldn't even cover 10% of government spending. Meanwhile, income taxes alone bring in over $2.5 trillion per year. And there's another issue. Tariffs are indirect taxes, meaning they aren't evenly distributed. Instead of taxing income based on earnings, tariffs hit consumers based on what they buy. This means low-income households get hit the hardest, since they spend a higher percentage of their income on goods that could be subject to tariffs. Let's take a real-world example. If a family making $40,000 a year spends 80% of their income on goods and services, a tariff-driven tax system would take a bigger chunk of their earnings compared to a wealthy household that only spends 40% of its income. That's why most economists argue that replacing income taxes with tariffs wouldn't be fair. It would shift more of the tax burden onto working-class Americans while benefiting wealthier individuals who spend more on non-taxed investments. Then, there's the retaliation problem. If the US placed extreme tariffs on imports, other countries would likely respond with their own tariffs, making it harder for American businesses to sell products overseas. This could lead to job losses, slower economic growth, and even higher inflation. And history has already given us a warning. In 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised import taxes to record levels. Other countries retaliated, global trade collapsed, and economists widely agree this helped turn a stock market crash into the Great Depression. So while tariffs can raise revenue, relying on them as the primary funding source for the government doesn't hold up in today's complex economy. But even if tariffs can't fully replace income taxes, can they at least help fund key industries or strengthen national security? Let's look at how tariffs are used to protect strategic industries. Most people think of tariffs as an economic tool, but they can also serve a national security purpose. Some industries aren't just about making money, they're critical to a country's survival. And in times of crisis, relying too much on foreign goods can be a major risk. Take semiconductors. the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Today, over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan and South Korea. The US once dominated semiconductor production, but as companies moved manufacturing offshore to cut costs, America's dependence on foreign-made chips grew. Then came the global chip shortage in 2020. With supply chains disrupted, industries from automakers to healthcare face major slowdowns. Suddenly, policymakers realized the danger. If geopolitical tensions escalated, access to critical technology could be cut off overnight. That's where tariffs come in. By imposing higher tariffs on imported semiconductors, the US can incentivize domestic production, reducing reliance on foreign suppliers and strengthening national security. The government has already taken steps, passing the CHIPS Act, which provides billions in funding to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the US. But semiconductors aren't the only example. Think about pharmaceuticals. Over 80% of active ingredients in US medications come from overseas, with a large portion sourced from China and India. If tensions between nations rise, supply disruptions could lead to shortages of life-saving drugs. This isn't just speculation. It has already happened. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries imposed export bans on medical supplies, leading to shortages of masks, ventilators, and even basic medicines. That's why some argue that tariffs on foreign pharmaceuticals and medical equipment could encourage companies to produce more in the US, ensuring a stable supply during emergencies. But there's a trade-off. Increasing tariffs to boost national security industries also raises costs for consumers. Domestic manufacturing is often more expensive than overseas production, meaning higher prices for everything from electronics to medicine. So, do tariffs make the country safer, or do they just make life more expensive? That's the ongoing debate. But one thing is clear. As global tensions rise, countries are rethinking their trade policies, shifting toward protectionism, which brings us to the final question. What happens next? Are we witnessing the return of protectionist economics, or is free trade still the future?
So, I just watched that video on tariffs. It's interesting how they can affect international trade.
Absolutely. I learned that tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods, which can raise prices for consumers.
Right? And they can also protect domestic industries by making imported goods more expensive.
Exactly. I read that in the US, tariffs have been used to support local farmers and manufacturers.
But it seems like they can also lead to trade wars, right?
Yes, they can. When one country raises tariffs, others might retaliate, which can escalate tensions.
I heard that during the trade war with China, tariffs on goods increased significantly, impacting prices for consumers.
That's true. Some studies suggest that US consumers pay billions more due to those increased tariffs.
It's fascinating how tariffs can have such a wide-ranging effect on the economy.
Definitely. They can influence everything from inflation rates to job markets.
I guess understanding tariffs is crucial for grasping how global trade works.
For sure. It's a complex topic, but so important for anyone interested in economics. Let's finish the video and see if they know what is next for the global economy.
Tariffs have shaped economies for centuries, but as the world becomes more interconnected, the big question remains: are they making a comeback, or is free trade still the future? Over the past few decades, global trade exploded, breaking down barriers between countries. Tariffs were lowered, and free trade agreements, like NAFTA and the European Union's single market, were signed to encourage economic growth. The idea was simple: the fewer trade barriers, the more business could flourish. For years, this strategy seemed to work. Consumers got cheaper goods, companies expanded overseas, and global supply chains became more efficient. But recent events have challenged that model. First, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the weaknesses of global supply chains. When China shut down factories, shortages of everything from computer chips to toilet paper rippled through the economy. Suddenly, countries realized that relying too heavily on imports made them vulnerable. Then came rising geopolitical tensions. From the US-China trade war to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, economic sanctions and trade restrictions became powerful weapons. Governments are now prioritizing self-sufficiency, focusing on economic nationalism instead of relying on international trade. As a result, we're seeing a shift. Countries are bringing back manufacturing, imposing tariffs, and rethinking global trade. In the US, Buy American policies are gaining traction, encouraging companies to manufacture domestically rather than overseas. But here's the challenge. Protectionism comes at a price. While tariffs may protect domestic industries, they also raise costs for businesses and consumers. If global supply chains unravel, production costs rise, leading to higher prices across the board. So what does the future look like? Will countries continue to use tariffs as a tool for economic security, or will there be a push to restore free trade? Some experts predict a hybrid approach, where countries balance trade policies, keeping some tariffs for key industries while allowing free trade in less sensitive sectors. Others warn that if tariffs become too extreme, we could see a new wave of trade wars, where countries keep imposing tariffs on each other, leading to economic slowdowns and inflation. The truth is, we don't know for sure, but what's clear is that tariffs aren't just a relic of the past. They are shaping the future of global economics right now. So what do you think? Are tariffs the ultimate power move or just a sneaky tax in disguise? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into economic history and policy.